So good evening to all participants. You're very welcome to our Hardwood Focus webinar on firewood production from thinning broadleaves. And it's really great to see over 700 participants registered for this event. This webinar is a joint event between Teagasc and the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. My name is Tom Houlihan. I'm a specialist with the Teagasc Forestry team and will be hosting this event this evening. Irish broadleaf forests account for 29% of all Irish forests, with many of these broadleaf farm forests still being quite young. People plant broadleaf forests for a wide range of reasons, including for biodiversity improvement, water quality protection, landscape enhancement, and timber production, of course. In many cases, owners have a mix of different objectives for their forests. If timber production is an important objective, then timely selective management is an essential element of good forest practice. And the focus of this webinar is on the efficient production of firewood from young broadleaf woodlands. As part of good management, timely first and second thinnings are essential steps to give the better trees in the forest sufficient space to grow vigorously and allow for the production of valuable hardwood sawlog down the road. The wood coming from early thinning operations can be considered a byproduct of good management. Supports are available to facilitate thinning operations from the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. And wood from thinnings can be used both by the owners themselves, and suitable material can also be sold as a quality and sustainable fuel. So I'm joined here for the next hour or so by our panelists. Jonathan Spatsy, Teagasc Forestry Advisor.
Evening, Noel.
Dr. Ian Short, Teagasc Forestry Researcher.
Hi.
And Noel Gavigan from IrBEA, the Irish Bioenergy Association.
Thanks, Tom. Good evening, all.
And we also have Liam Kelly, Teagasc Forestry Advisor, who will be looking after your questions.
Good evening, all.
The format for this evening is that we'll have two short videos, each followed by a panel discussion. And the videos will focus on a recent second thinning operation in Limerick, followed by a look at sustainable firewood processing by a local family-run firewood business. These videos will be followed by a presentation from Noel Gavigan, who's the project executive at the Irish Bioenergy Association, on firewood as a renewable energy source. And the final part of this event will be a live question and answer session, allowing you to ask questions of the expert panel. In preparation for our Q&A session, you can submit your question using the Zoom Q&A function. If you're on a laptop, this Q&A button is probably at the bottom center of your screen, while if you are on a tablet or smartphone, it's probably at the top of your screen. So you can submit your questions at any time, and we'll get to as many as possible of them later. Please bear in mind that the focus of this webinar is on firewood production and relevant management to achieve this. And also, just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. So now we go to our first video, where we meet Jonathan Sykes, a forest owner from Limerick. We also meet Padraig O'Tuma, his forestry consultant, and Jonathan Spatsy, his Teagasc Forestry Advisor. This video focuses on firewood production from thinning broadleaves, and I think it gives a good idea of how Jonathan Sykes, along with his advisory and consultancy support, went about the planning and managing of his thinnings for firewood production. So off we go now to see this video.
My wife Betty and I decided to plant 20 hectares of farm here in Springfield, County Limerick,
about 20 years ago with broadleaf species as an ideal complement to the rest of the farm, including the hospitality business we have here. Well, we wanted to diversify the income on the farm, so there were the forestry grants, the forest premia, and then eventually we knew there would be a firewood supply, and finally sawlog. But we also wanted to provide recreational opportunities for our guests. Well, we started active management of our forest here when the trees were about 8 meters tall, and we got great assistance from our local forestry advisor from Teagasc, Jonathan Spatsy, and he explained to us how, when and which trees to favour, and it's really stood to our woodland here.
For effective production of hardwoods, the selection of vigorous quality trees earlier on is essential. To assist owners with the cost of early thinnings, the Woodland Improvement Grant Scheme, funded by the Department of Agriculture, is at hand. Operations include the removal of poorer quality trees and the high pruning of selected better quality trees, all of which will ensure fast growth of fine timber.
After discussing continuous cover forestry with Jonathan Spatsy from Teagasc, we decided to go for the system. There's a grant involved, and we engaged the services of Podrico Tuma CCF Forester.
I started working with Jonathan here in 2019. So far we've carried out one transformation thinning where we selected the best quality trees. We're also encouraging the existing natural regeneration that you see behind me, but we're underplanting Douglas fir as well for diversity and future trees. For the second thinning, we already had a forest road in place, so once felling licence and woodland improvement scheme approval was received, we put together a harvesting plan and timber sale. We selected all the quality trees for long-term retention, marked the competing trees for removal. We use a conventional harvester and forwarder units to cut and extract timber to the roadside. I found this was more economical and efficient than the chainsaw and quad system that was used previously.
We extracted about 30 cubic metres per hectare, which was used for firewood. Some was used in our own boiler, and the rest was sold to a local firewood dealer.
It's important to appreciate the difference between commercial firewood lengths and firewood for home use. The first needs to be 3 metres in length and of a minimum 10 centimetre diameter at the small end. This is to facilitate lorry transportation and mechanical cutting and splitting. In the second case, firewood for home use, we have greater flexibility, and the dimension of the lengths really depends on the equipment available to each woodland owner.
Firewood is a great source of income when your broadleaf forest is young, but a broadleaf forest can do so much more than that. For example, we've just made a kitchen dresser from our own thinnings, and we look forward to continuing to thin our broadleaf woodlands.
So we go now to our panel, and maybe first off, Ian, we have seen that in general, thinning starts from 8 meters in height. When do you expect subsequent thinnings to take place, and why is it important to thin?
Well, first off, it's important to thin because you then benefit your plantation, your stand of trees, favouring the best trees so that they grow vigorously. You're taking out any diseased trees as well, so that maintains the health of the stand of trees. If you do the first thinning, say at 8, 9 or 10 metres tall, you could probably expect to go in again in 4 or 5 years' time. It has to be at least 4 years' time to avail of the grant. But if you do the thinning right in the first time, then you'll create sufficient space for the trees to continue growing, and they won't need thinning again until at least 40 years later.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And Jonathan, just to come to you, in the video, a forest road was already in place. What can owners do if they don't yet have a suitable forest road in situ?
Well, the importance of a well laid out forest road cannot be understated. For forest owners approaching for thinning, it's critical to look at developing a suitable road ahead of the thinning. And the function of a road is really to facilitate safe access for timber collection, in general by lorries, and efficient transportation to buyers. So both are important to minimize transportation costs. So without a suitable road in place, the timber marketing opportunities available to a given woodland are significantly reduced, and in relation to firewood, probably mostly confined to own use. The key point here is that owners can avail of a forest road grant funded by the Department of Agriculture to cover the cost of construction of a forest road, and applications can be submitted 3 years ahead of thinning to facilitate the processing, construction and the settling of the road before it's put into use.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And Noel, can you outline how much firewood is actually used in Ireland?
Yeah, our estimates, sometimes quite difficult to quantify in terms of a lot of firewood is untraded, but we're estimating coming from our forestry crop approximately 250,000 cubic meters per year. So, you know, that's providing quite a large portion of solid fuels in the country.
Thanks, Noel.
Okay.
Jonathan, while in the longer term the aim is to grow timber for sawing, most of the early thinning currently goes for firewood. How can an owner measure the firewood timber harvested from the early thinning operation?
Yes, firewood timber can either be measured by weight or by volume. When measuring by weight, it's important really to keep in mind that different species have different densities, so that the same stack of same size logs could weigh differently if, for example, he's made of oak or ash. Also, depending on the moisture content of the logs, the same stack of logs could vary in weight considerably. So if the sale method is by weight, such as, for example, weighing a lorry over a weighbridge, it is important to factor into the price, for example, agreed per ton with the buyer, the species and the moisture content. If measuring by volume, the meter cube solid equivalent is used, and this does not change between species and moisture content. So in this sense is more reliable, but is a bit more difficult to measure. The total firewood volume could be measured from timber stacks, or, as more often is the case, as loaded on a timber lorry. For example, a timber lorry of 3 meter lengths of moderate straightness and 10 centimeters small end will contain approximately 50-60% of solid timber, while the rest is air. So as a comparative example for our viewers, typically a lorry and trailer comprised of 4 bays of timber lengths of 3 meters would contain approximately 30 cubic meters of firewood with an equivalent weight ranging from 30 to 20 tons depending on species and moisture.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that. Ian, what are firewood volumes that owners would expect from first and second thinning?
Well, some of the work that I've done looking at the volumes coming out from first and second thinnings of broadleaves, they're coming out, you saw there Jonathan Sykes was saying there was 30 cubic meters per hectare he was getting out. And I've come out with similar figures, anything between 25 and 35 cubic meters per hectare. That's at 7 centimeters small end diameter. Now for home use, you could go smaller than that, and I've measured down to 5 centimeters. And when you measure to 5 centimeters, it could go up to maybe 40 to 45 cubic meters per hectare. And it makes a big difference going down to that small diameter, but that small diameter is really only useful for small use at home rather than for commercial use.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And final question in this session to Jonathan. In the context of broadleaf management, what is the outlook for ash?
Well, the ongoing spread of ash dieback in Ireland has a very serious implication for the future and health or survival of ash woodlands. As our viewers are aware, our ash is now affected by a fungal infection that causes dieback. We already seen the impact across Europe and the UK, and it is likely in Ireland that affected woodlands will require timely restructuring. This, in many cases, will involve the production of firewood. So it's important that owners at this point are aware of what's involved, so they would be able to take full advantage of market opportunities. In terms of management cost, the recent reconstitution and underplanting scheme funded by the Department of Agriculture provides funding for owners. In terms of the best course of action, each woodland will be different, and different responses really will be needed on the ground to factor in owners' objectives and also health and safety consideration. In Teagasc, in the last number of years, we've organised a series of events on ash remedial silviculture, and we've worked on the ground with owners through our local advisory services. And in the coming year, we will be holding a new event to review best practice in relation to the management of plantations affected by ash dieback.
Tom, if I can also add there, in Teagasc we have been doing a bit of research as well about ash dieback and the management of stands, remedial silviculture of ash stands with ash dieback. And there's also a breeding program that's looking at breeding tolerant provenances of Irish ash as well.
Right, thank you for that, Ian. And thanks to our panel for that. And they can take a short break now while we go to our second video. And in this video, we again meet Jonathan Sykes, who discusses his firewood systems. And we also meet Ned and John Liston from Liston Fuel Logs. And they show us how they process firewood and prepare for sale. And again, this gives us a good insight into firewood preparation for market. So over now to the video.
So by 2013, our forest was producing good thinnings, and we decided to invest in installing a wood-burning boiler system, which to heat our tourist accommodation. And this year alone, it saved us €20,000 in heating oil. The woodland is managed under continuous cover and is regularly thinned every 4 to 5 years. The best trees are retained and competitors thinned out. The firewood produced from the initial thinnings is just a byproduct of management, with valuable sawlog being our main goal. We produce 2 grades of firewood. The smaller logs are used on site to feed our own boiler. We use a quad and trailer to move the timber from the woodland to the drying tunnel. Once the timber is sufficiently dry at about 20% moisture, we move it to the boiler house for use. Larger logs are sold by lorry load to Ned Liston, a local firewood dealer.
My name is Ned Liston and I run a firewood business with my son John. We source hardwood and softwood timber from local woodlands and produce firewood and kindling. We supply customers in Limerick and the surrounding area. Last year we joined the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme, which guarantees that the moisture content of our fuel is under 20%. This guarantees that it is a clean burn and also provides plenty heating for the customer. All our equipment we use in our yard is now 100% powered by solar electricity, coming from our new photovoltaic unit installed this year. This includes the firewood processor, the drying floor and the forklift.
When the timber arrives in our yard, it is stacked for approximately a year and a half to let it season and dry out. When it is ready, we then put it through our electric firewood processor, which cuts and splits the logs and puts them into a bucket ready for drying.
Once cut, the logs are dried over a ventilated floor, which we installed for that purpose. We also have a kiln and use it for drying kindling and occasionally other timber down to the moisture content of 20%. Once the firewood is ready for sale, it is bagged and placed in our new ventilated polytunnel, ready for delivery to our customers. The majority of our customers are in 30-kilometre radius, so we don't have to travel too far. For the hardwoods, we mainly sell it in the bulk bags, which we have here, various lengths in varying from 200 millimetres up to 400 millimetres to suit particular customers.
Firewood can be a great fuel option if it is dried to under 20% moisture content, which makes it very environmentally friendly, and that is what we are doing here with our business.
So just a couple of brief questions to the panel following that video. Jonathan, maybe to come to you. Between the 2 videos, we have seen a range of extraction systems. What are the options available to owners?
Well, when talking about harvesting system and equipment, the choice of forest equipment used should always be informed by site characteristics and environmental consideration, with particular attention to soil condition and protecting water quality. With that in mind, timber is heavy and difficult to transport, so where appropriate, as we've seen in the video, the use of mechanized harvesting with purpose-built thinning harvester forwarder with chainsaw assist has been shown to work well in medium to large size plantation, especially from second thinning. In this case, it is important that contractors selected have suitable thinning equipment and have experience in working in broadleaf woodlands, as well as, of course, relevant insurance and training. For smaller woodlands, early thinnings, or woodland with particular sensitivities, the small-scale equipment such as chainsaw and tractor system, like Jonathan Sykes would have used in forest thinning, can also work very well. But if using small-scale equipment, it is important to be mindful that the extraction cost will be considerably higher than using a fully mechanized approach. As an in-between option, in Ireland, we have a small number of small-scale purpose-built forwarders. They offer greater efficiency compared to a tractor chainsaw system and a lower impact than larger machines, but come at a greater harvesting cost than larger machine. To conclude, at all times, safety first. So it is very important that all contractors adopt safe practices and have taken appropriate training and wear the correct personal protective equipment.
Okay, thanks for that, Jonathan. And just moving to Ian, what is the heating output of different broadleaf species?
Okay, well, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, the energy that comes from wood over the different species is fairly similar. So when the wood is bone dry, when there's 0% moisture content, it's around about between 18 and 19 megajoules per kilogram of dry wood. Now, Jonathan did mention that moisture content has a bearing on this, and indeed, the more moisture there is, it also impacts on the energy content. So if we say take ash, for example, ash at 0% moisture content would be about 18 megajoules per kilogram of dry wood. But if it's up at 40% moisture content, that's then down to 5.2 gigajoules per cubic meter, which is at 0% moisture content, 9.6 gigajoules per cubic meter. This is because the moisture content has an impact, but also the density as well, and the density of the wood. So comparing Sitka spruce with ash, Sitka spruce density is around about 360 kilograms per cubic meter. Ash is 527 kilograms per cubic meter. So per cubic meter of dry wood, you get more energy content out of something like ash than you do from Sitka. And ash would be better than, say, Ardagh as well. Ardagh would be more similar to Sitka than it would be to ash. And that's because of the density and the moisture content.
Okay, so I suppose the message there is to dry it down to the relevant moisture content to make sure you get better energy value.
Yeah, and if you do dry it down to the moisture content, you obviously get better energy value from the same volume of timber.
Thanks for that. And just Noel, just finally to you, how long should timber be stacked for air drying before processing if you want to achieve these types of figures?
It's a combination of two things. Number one is the siting of it. It's very important to put timber in the right place. Really and truly what you need is good access to a windy site. Anywhere that's enclosed, you'll find that timber is not going to dry very well. Definitely in a closed shed, it's not going to, but if you have or if it's beside a wall, that can hinder it. In the forest itself is not very good because the airflow could be down too little. But if you have a good windy site, get it up off the ground, and I'll show you some in the slides later on. I'll maybe show you some examples of what people have done in that. And if you're getting your timber out in the spring, and if it's well stocked, you should be well able to get it down to under 25 and potentially under 20 in the first year before the heating season. But the earlier you get it, the better. Like the months of May, June, and July are the key months to have your firewood cut and drying. And that's really where you get most drying. Now, you will get obviously outside those months, but it's really they're the powerful ones. Now, what was interesting in the video there, where they're using a polytunnel, and polytunnels are excellent. They're a very cheap structure, but they're also, when you allow a lot of air through them, and you see some people putting windbreaker on them, on the lower parts, and that allows your airflow through, and you need that air going through, and the polytunnel lifts the temperature as well, so they're excellent for drying out firewood.
Yeah, so an efficient process.
Yes, very efficient.
Thanks for that. So now, Noel, we'll keep you in the spotlight, and we might go directly over to your presentation, if that's okay. That's okay. I'll just start up here.
Now, it'll be as brief as possible. I know we were trying to get this through in about 10 minutes. So, first off, look, I'm working with the Irish Bioenergy Association, so we work a lot on both on the wood fuel side of it, biogas, and also the biofuels, biodiesel, and things like that. So, look, you can check out the website if you want to have a look at any of that. But we're operational since 1999, so we're quite a while in the game at this point in view. Critically, what we're doing here that's relevant to it is the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Scheme. IrBEA manages and administers the scheme, and basically it was set up in 2009, along with assistance from the Department of Agriculture and from Waterford Institute of Technology and SCAI. So it's something that we have set up for certifying wood fuel suppliers around the country. That's the scheme there. You can see the map on the side of your screen there, which is basically, that's all the suppliers we have around the country, different colour codes for who they are. That map, you'll find it on our website if you want to have a look at who's certified in your area, and you can find out what they supply as well. So that's basically our resource there for anyone that wants to look at it. In terms of bioenergy itself, it's very important to note that worldwide, bioenergy provides 2/3 of all the renewable energy that we use. Wind is about 5%, hydro, as you can see there, is 18%, but bioenergy is by and large the largest source, and is also about half of the energy used in Europe that is renewable comes from bioenergy. So it's critically important as a renewable source of energy. Now, just quickly on what Ian was saying earlier on, and this is a perfect introduction to this slide, in terms of the importance of drying your firewood. If you're going to into this, it's quite an interesting business for someone to do when they're already having forestry there. But the drying is really a critical component. And we've just taken two examples there. Now, obviously, they're the same piece of firewood, but we're comparing it depending on what it would be like with different moisture contents. And what it should be is under 20. So we've just one measure down at 17. This is the actual moisture content of that. So within that, you can see that the volume of water that would be in the piece of timber. You have 900 grams of water, about 180 grams 900 grams of timber, of dry timber, 180 grams of water. And that is a very efficient fuel, will work very well in your stove. You can see in total it's about 100 or 1100 grams. But if that was 40% moisture, which we see a lot of firewood on the market that's uncertified, and people are taking it straight from the forest and trying to use it. You can see there's a massive volume of water in that. It's over half a litre of water in that. It's got, it's weighing 1.5 kilos, that single piece of timber, but you've such a volume of water. By the time you boil off all that water, there's very little heat left for heating the house. So critically, we would say that you should be looking at the moisture content is the most important thing when you're looking at quality of firewood. Just to give an example as well, the other thing you see people talking about a lot now lately is emissions and particulates and the amount of smoke. But there's a dramatic reduction in the level of particulates that come from dry timber. You can see here it's at 7.2 grams per ton if you have it down to 20%. Whereas if it's only up to as far as 30%, so 10% higher, you've got over is that 4 times the amount of particulates that it's producing. So getting it dry does two things. Number one, it's far greater in efficiency, but it's also much cleaner material. And also, other advantages is it protects your appliance. If you've got a lot of soot being produced, it will start to corrode your stove and things like that. So it's very important to get it right. Kiln drying does make a difference, but air drying, once you get it down to that under that 20%, that it doesn't matter whether it's by a kiln or air drying. A kiln is obviously faster. Air drying is something that is cheaper to do. The second thing, and again, it was mentioned earlier, we've quite a difference between hardwood and softwood, but we've just took this picture here is 2 pieces of firewood. On the left, you can see a piece of ash. On the right, you can see, on my right is a piece of spruce. Now, both of those pieces of timber weigh the same. Both of them have the same amount of heat in them. But as you can see, the difference is one is much larger than the other. And basically, the only difference between hardwood and softwood is one is a much denser product. So they both have similar value in terms of that size, but one is just a bulkier thing to be dealing with. What we would recommend those people that are using, if you must use an open fire, always the recommendation is to use a stove. But if you are using an open fire, that's where hardwood will be better used, whereas softwood or hardwood is perfect in a stove. But that's just a comparison so you can see the difference between the two. Just very quickly into different appliances that we see that are being used. Obviously, pizza ovens are becoming popular quite now, so we've just thrown that in there. Your stove is a very important parcel of heating a home. And there is any amount of them on the market going for the eco-design stove standard now, which is also very useful in terms of ensuring it's efficient and burns correctly. Stoves are very popular in the country. There's a huge amount of stoves being installed in houses, and it really does. If you've got an open fireplace, you're losing a lot of heat, losing 70% of the heat. A stove will reduce that down to about 20%, you know, going up the chimney. So it's a very important thing to put in. Your range cooker then, obviously, in a lot of houses in Ireland, we have a range cooker. So obviously firewood fits in nicely into that. And then lastly, I have an example similar to what was in the video earlier on, smaller version. This is where you're using wood logs in an outside facility, but that's heating your central heating system. And again, they're very efficient, ideal for somebody with their own bit of forestry or has access to some firewood that they want to use for heating a building or a number of buildings. And those sort of gasification stoves, as they're called, are a very decent technology. Very quickly, in terms of producing the right fuel and doing it correctly, as we're saying, it must be below 25% moisture content. Ultimately, it'll be going to under 20. We have been working with the government recently to get that brought into regulations, and it is going to be regulated starting next year. So that if someone is buying firewood from the forecourt and you're looking at selling firewood publicly, you will have to make sure it's meeting the European standard or under 25%. That's just an example of a very good operational yard. You can see there again using a polytunnel with the net wrapping on the windbreaker around the sides, and that allows the airflow through. And that's a very popular thing you see in a lot of even commercial producers of firewood use that a lot because it's relatively cheap storage, but it also acts very much as a solar kiln, as some would call it. Next one then is just an example of some other examples of air drying. So you can see this is an example we've seen in Austria. This is a co-op owned by a number of growers. I think it was, by memory, about 28 different growers had formed a co-op. They all brought their firewood and their wood chip and processed it through this one co-op. And it was very efficient, a good way of doing it. And in Austria, they're quite advanced in that. Forestry is a big part of the tradition of dealing with forestry. So the co-op structure has worked very well for them over there. This is standard stacking that you would see. Again, you can just see the gap under it. It's kept off the ground. That's critically important, that you keep firewood off the ground. It's, you're only pulling up dampness if it's not, and getting that airflow underneath it really makes a difference. Now this is from Cotterbross in Limerick, just up the road from Liston, and this is the best example you've come across. As you can see, they have the firewood or the wood logs well off the ground, sitting up on rails, and they're also covering it to keep the rain off the top. So that's an excellent example of how you can get it down to under 20%, in a relatively short space of time. Now, what we would recommend, and what is generally the practice, is you would dry it in the stack like that down to about 35 or 30 as a minimum, and then you can process it and dry it in log form then. But this is a good way of getting the most of the moisture off. You shouldn't process it when it's too wet. If it's above 35 in particular, you have a good chance of mold forming, and you want to be selling this to customers. The last thing they want to do is see mold. It will add a little bit of an odor to the firewood as well. So if you want to have a good quality, clean product that people like to see, just make sure it's properly dried before you process it, because to just avoid molding like that. And then finally, just to give you a brief overview of, we've put a slide together earlier on this year to look at if you're heating a typical Irish home, and we took an example from SEI and how much heat it uses to heat the average home. And we looked at various fuels, and I'll just explain this, and this is all to do with, we've two things we're trying to do. Number one is reduce carbon dioxide emissions. We all know that the climate crisis that's going on at the moment, or will be for all of our lives anyway. So it's something that we all have to be very conscious of. And we have here is the number of the kilograms of CO2 produced per year. So if you're using any of these fuels, it gives you an idea, and I'll go through it a little bit more detail in a second. On this side then, going across the bottom, is the amount of particulate matter, so the amount of smoke that's been produced. And again, you can see this is in kilograms also per year. So you can see there you have 5 kilograms up as far as 50, but then in CO2 you're from 500 up to 5,000. So if you're using kerosene to heat the average Irish home, you can see there you're producing nearly 4.5 tons of CO2 per year. So it's extremely high. If you're using gas, it's down somewhat. If you're using heat pumps, now these numbers here basically are depends on how much renewable electricity is on the grid. Currently in Ireland, it tends to range about 350 grams per kilowatt hour. So in around a little under 2 tons of CO2 you'd be producing if you're using a heat pump to heat your house. If we get electricity down to where we want it by 2030, you'd be producing about 1 ton of CO2. Now, if you're using, but you can see there, all of them are producing very little, say, smoke, or none for the heat pumps. If you're using wood fuels in an open fire, as you can see here, again, the CO2 is very low, but you are producing quite a lot of smoke. If you're using an old type stove, again, you're producing quite a lot of particulate matter, a lot of smoke, but the CO2 level is down quite a lot. But if we just put in here the eco-design stove, which is the new European standard for stoves, this long, I can't tell you exactly what that stands for at this point in time, but this is a study done in UCD recently where they used good quality firewood in a standard stove. This is the actual result they got, which is quite low. Ultimately, we're trying to get to 0, 0 here. We'll never get there, but that's the focus. And you can see a pellet stove here is down very low as well. But with a good eco-design stove, this is what it should be for the European standard. If this is what a standard stove is getting, we can expect that firewood used in a proper eco-design stove or a good design stove will be very, very low in all fronts. And that's critically important if we're going to look at doing the right thing here. Sorry, just go back to that one. And just by comparison, if you're looking at, say, turf or coal, when we put them into the chart originally, but they were way off the chart. They were gone way off over to the top and right as I'm looking at it. So they weren't really, you couldn't use those on this chart. But it's just an example. This is what we're aiming at. And as you can see, if we're using firewood, it really is ticking all the boxes, and it's a very worthwhile piece. So that's really it. Look, if anyone is interested in becoming a certified supplier of wood fuel, you can contact myself or any of us here in the Irish Bioenergy Association. We're more than happy to talk you through the process, and we run our own events there at times as well. If you want to keep an eye on the website, you'll see those coming up.
That's great. Thanks very much. A lot of really relevant and useful information there, Noel, so thanks for that. And again, we'll go to our panel for a couple of questions before we open it to our audience. Noel, do you see wood fuel being used in the future, both in rural and in urban settings? Absolutely.
Only this week we had Mariai speaking at an event for us. That's the research centre in Cork, which really looks at the whole challenge of climate change. And the long-term view on worldwide basis is that we're going to about a quarter of the world energy is going to have to come from bioenergy. And so firewood is part of that, wood pellets is part of that, all of the products that are coming from forests is part of that. In Ireland, it's reckoned to be about 1/3 of our energy is going to need to come from biomass. And we have a forestry resource, we're a very good environment for growing forestry, and we can do so, looking at the videos earlier on, I was very interested to see, and it's a very good image to see that forest that has been properly tinned is producing a lot of firewood, but the forest floor was alive. The amount of biodiversity that was there, and that's, you really are creating an environment there that is desirable. And I think it's a testament to what proper forest management can do.
Thank you. We mentioned the Wood Fuel Quality Association, and how can firewood producers join this association?
They can just check out our website there. It's WFQA.org, or call myself. Or we'll happily talk. We're bringing new people onto it every month, and so anyone that's interested, we'll talk them through the process at any point in time.
Yeah, and staying with you for a couple of more questions, Noel, we'll look at firewood for home use and what would be the best practice for effective drying of this down to 20% moisture content.
Well, if somebody is drying it themselves, the key thing is you need to get it up off the ground. Ideally, get it into a place where you're getting plenty of airflow through it. So if that's, so not in a hidden corner somewhere. The polytunnels, as I said earlier on, are very good for that. You might have seen also that slide I showed earlier, that Austrian co-op where they had a structure there with latted timber to allow airflow through it. But any place where you can get the timber off the ground and get good airflow, they're the two components of it.
Okay, and finally, Noel, where can owners source these new generation eco stoves? And are there any grants available for these?
There is no grants available at the moment, unfortunately. We are looking to see, can we do something about that? But they are available as of January of next year. The only thing that will be available is eco-design stoves. It's a right across Europe for the last 7 or 8 years, they must have eco-design. Ireland got a dispensation from that for a number of years, but that runs out in January. So we do be into a number of shops. They're all very much aware of this, that the older multi-fuel stove. The one difference I would say is that we're used to seeing stoves where you can burn coal, burn turf, burn firewood in it. But the new standards in the stoves and the way they're built, you generally won't be able to burn more than one type of fuel in it. If it's a timber stove, it'll be a timber stove. And you'll see they're actually highly efficient. They work very, very well. But because of the design, they literally just will not, like they don't have if you're burning timber correctly, you're burning it on a flat surface. You're not burning it on a grate. So you're not going to be able to burn turf or coal on that, because the ashes will kill the fire very, very quickly. So a timber eco-design stove is designed very differently to be very efficient. But now they're very, very efficient in terms of volumes of fuel going into them and the heat they throw out. But you will have to watch the fact that there's only one fuel they will burn it from now on.
Okay. Moving to Jonathan. Jonathan, how can owners improve efficiencies if they are, we'll say, small-scale woodland owners?
Yeah, it's an important question. Private woodlands in Ireland tend to be small scale, so achieving economies of scale can be difficult, especially at the smaller end of the spectrum. So in this case, timely planning and good design first comes really in sharp focus. Is something like a well laid out extraction racks network within the woodland, and connecting this with a well-placed forest road, as I mentioned earlier, can make quite a big difference in helping with efficiencies. Also, mechanizing with using contractors with purpose-built forest equipment might not be an option for some of the smaller woodlands. So one way to achieve economy of scale perhaps could be for owners to collaborate with neighboring woodland owners, through sharing perhaps a contractor visiting a townland. And this is something that forest owner groups have been quite active in recent years. Another way, as we've seen also for Jonathan Sykes in the video, could be developing processing on site, so trying to eliminate the need for transportation off-site. This is not always possible for all owners, but a number of owners have done this successfully, setting up some of their own firewood businesses. And like again, for the example of Jonathan Sykes, expanding further, investing in milling equipment and adding further value that way. So this is another way to try to improve efficiency. The final thing I would say in this regard is that really the main value of early thinnings is to improve quality and the vigor, I would add, to selected quality trees. So while it is important to trying to optimize efficiency, this message should not be lost when considering, harvesting and marketing early thinnings.
Okay, and just one more for you. You mentioned that the Woodland Improvement Grant Scheme is available to owners to help with the cost of the initial thinning. And can you just give us a small bit more detail on that?
Yes, the Woodland Improvement Scheme is really the go-to scheme for broadleaf woodlands. Just a bit of a summary is divided in two main elements. The first element, 1, provides funding for first and second thinning of broadleaves, cover cost of operation like high pruning of selected trees and the removal of competing trees, both of which will in time ensure quality. The first thinning, as Ian mentioned earlier, starts around 8 meters, with a second intervention taking place 4 years after that and before trees are 50 meters in height. The second element, it continues to cover forestry elements. This second element supports the production of commercial timber while retaining forest cover at all times through continuous cover management. This is the option that Jonathan Sykes adopted as we've seen in the video. It is available to both broadleaves and conifer mixtures, but it's not suitable to all sites as it requires, among other things, wind-firm sites, so reasonable drainage, good rooting. It covers 3 thinnings over a period of 12 years, and it aims to transform our current uniform plantation towards permanent productive forest with focus on growing high-quality logs to large size, the use of natural regeneration, and the use of multiple species. So the overall outcome of this process are species diverse productive forest with a very high ecosystem services output.
Okay, thank you for that, Jonathan. Just Ian, a couple of brief questions before we go to the the open Q&A. Firewood from initial thinning is a byproduct of good management towards future high quality logs. And when do we expect these selected trees favoured by initial thinning to become ready for sawing? So our final crop, when will that become on stream?
Well, that's very site dependent and species dependent, and also management dependent as well. So let's say if we have oak and you manage the oak well and maybe put it into a free growth type system where you're doing heavy thinnings, and your selected potential crop trees are always open to grow, that they're not being competed with against any time through the rotation. On some sites, you may be able to get DBH diameter growth of at least 1 centimetre per year. And if you're going for a target diameter of maybe 60 centimetres, you could maybe get saw logs starting to come out around about 60, 80 years' time. But a lot of the time, it would be more towards the 80 to 100 or 120 years, unless management is done intensively. Other species, something like sycamore or ash, you might be getting saw log coming out, or small saw log coming out from about year 40 all the way through to year 60 or year 80. So it's very species dependent, it's very site dependent, and it's management dependent. But the more management you put in, the sooner you'll get that saw log coming in.
Okay, thank you for that, Ian. I'm going to go now to the Q&A section of this webinar, where you as participants get to put your questions to our expert panel. And this is being handled by our colleague Liam Kelly, who has been keeping an eye on the questions. So Liam, have you any questions coming in at this stage?
Yeah, can you hear me? There's been lots of questions here on the Q&A tab. I've answered one or two briefly, but there has been a number of questions in relation to ash and ash dieback, and I suppose I'm just going to bundle them together really. But I suppose the main example I'm seeing here is when the trees get diseased. Is there a certain length of time that you can get to cut them, or if they're very badly diseased, will the future firewood would it be impacted? So just maybe Jonathan, you might just take that for a second if you don't mind.
Ash dieback has been spreading around the country, and it's been more prevalent in some counties than others. But once settles in an area, it tends to spread rather quickly. That's been our experience on the ground. So the window of opportunities from when the disease sets in to when it takes over the plantation might be relatively short. I don't think we have conclusive figures in terms of how many years that would take, and maybe Ian could come in on this as well. But I would advise in general owners to really be vigilant and proactive in relation to their plantation. And if the disease is setting in, it's time to look at management options. And again, I refer to what I mentioned earlier. There's a scheme available, and maybe might be wise to start looking at options within that as well.
Okay, and as a follow-on to that, Ian, just in relation to regrowth from an ash crop that has been felled, is there any way of dealing with the regrowth or the coppice? Would you have any suggestions? Or
well, one of the trial sites that I've been working on, we did small coop felling. So we felled a small area and then controlled that coppice regrowth by using a mulcher just skimmed over the top of the stumps, and that was very good at controlling the coppice regrowth. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's what everybody should be doing, because it's quite expensive to do that. Other than that, it's a difficult one. You could either manually control that coppice regrowth, or you could maybe look at controlling it with herbicides. One issue I would have with herbicide is if you have any existing ash that's still tolerant or healthy, that it may be impacted by the herbicide through flashback, where it's taken in through the stump and then it's taken down into the roots, and it transfers from root to root into a healthy tree. So I'd be a little bit wary if the standard tree still has some healthy ash in there that are being kept because they are showing some tolerance. But otherwise, it's manual weed control, really, I think, with brush cutters.
Okay, and again, Ian, just another question, just in relation to native woodland. You mentioned there that getting involved to cut or to start thinning at the appropriate height and age. But in native woodland, would the same rules apply? An owner could get involved.
Yeah, native woodland. There's no real reason to change the management. You can still manage native woodlands on a productive basis as well. And they would still require thinning at pretty much the same time. They've been normally planted at the same spacing. Normally you'd have relatively similar growth rates. And you want the trees to continue growing and continue being vigorous. And if the trees are continually kept vigorous, they're less likely to be susceptible to diseases and pests as well. So the management of native woodlands should be similar to commercial broadleaf woodlands as well. Maybe later on, when you get to 30 years, maybe management might be a little bit different if you're then thinking about other objectives like management of understory vegetation, that you want to increase the biodiversity from that point of view. But otherwise, I would say thin at the same time as you would normally. Yeah.
Just moving to Noel for a second. Moisture meter, a few people have been asking about moisture meters. Where are they available, or and maybe, you know, what type of one should you get?
Yeah, seeing there's a number of questions come in on that there. There's a bit of a question over whether moisture meters are a good thing or not. They're not the most accurate. I've seen one supplier spend up €1,400 on a moisture meter, which was absolutely useless. So, and yet you can buy cheap ones for, you know, 50 quid or 20 quid even. I believe one of the multiple stores had one there at one point, and it actually wasn't so bad. But it's, once the moisture is under, say, 28%, tend to be relatively accurate. When it's above that, they can be all over the place. There's a load of different brands. I wouldn't recommend any because I've seen such variation, and what you pay sometimes doesn't make any difference at all. But the best test, and what we require all suppliers to be able to do, is what's called the oven moisture test. And it's very simple to do. It takes a small bit of time, but it's basically taking a sample of the timber, weighing it, drying it in a domestic oven at 105 degrees for a number of hours, and re-weighing it and calculating the moisture loss from that. And it is absolutely 100% accurate, and it is definitive as well. So it's something, a much better way of determining moisture content if you want to be sure. But other than that, for spot checks, you can use the ones with the probes. I wouldn't recommend a particular brand because I've seen such variation in them. But they can be relatively useful, but you want to be just back checking it with an oven test to be sure.
Okay, and while I have you, how long should timber be allowed dry is the first part, and also, is it important to cover them?
Covering, well, in terms of, look, obviously rain is going to wet it. So if you see large stacks, what you tend to find is the top 3 feet of that is going to remain somewhat wet. You're not going to get material under 25% in the top couple of feet. So quite often what happens with a firewood producer is they will take, as they're taking down the timber, they'll take the top scoop and put that down on the bottom again and get that the next time around, because it's just not going to be dry. If you're doing wood chip, it's different. You could blend it in with it. But generally the top logs are just not going to be dry. If you're covering it, obviously then that'll make a difference. And yeah, I've seen the picture earlier on where they're using a canopy to cover it. But that's quite, you know, there's a health and safety aspect of putting that stuff up as well. You know, and you're climbing on stacks is not something that is recommended anymore. So there is some difficulty in that, obviously. It's obviously, as I was saying earlier on, if it's indoors, if it's in an airy shed or it's in a tunnel, it'll dry much better. In terms of time-wise, really it's a factor of how well it's positioned. You should be able to, if you have stuff cut in the spring and it's in a good facility, you should be able to air dry that and have it ready for use the following winter. Now you should definitely get it to 25. Getting it to 20 takes a little bit more work, or takes a little bit more, you want to have an exceptionally good site for that, or you want to be exceptionally good at how you're stacking and how you're putting it together outside to get it to under 20 in 1 year. In fairness, most people who want to get it under 20 will look at a 2-year cycle.
Okay, and one question there: if timber does dry down and it goes back out into the open again, will it regain moisture again?
Well, if it's under rain, obviously it will. But if you're just talking about if it's in a under roof, so to speak, if when you put out timber, it tends to, the balance is around between 15 and 20% in Irish conditions. So during the summer, it'll go down, and it could creep down as low as 15 if it was left out, in the right conditions. And then during the winter, that same piece might go up as far as 18 or 19, and it'll literally change with the weather. It'll change with the humidity. So, but generally the balance in Ireland is in around this 16 to 18% mark, in around there. But it depends on the humidity of the air. So wintertime expect it to be a little bit wetter. I would not see it going above 20 if it was dry enough. Or if it was under 20, I wouldn't see it going above 20.
Okay, and getting back to Jonathan, can you give some indication of what price would they generate at roadside?
Yeah, it's always a bit difficult to generalize in terms of prices, because as you know, the price is dependent on the site, on the distance from the buyer, access, etc. But there is an average price that is being quoted in many occasions, and taking the cubic meter as a unit of measure, around a €60 cubic meter or roadside for commercial grade material is a price that seems to be recurrent.
Okay, and there was one question there on just commercial machinery towards using small farm size machinery like tractors and quad bikes, etc. What would be generally the difference in cost?
Again, same disclaimer as before, in the sense that they can vary a lot with local variation or site specific, but there are some general averages there for a reasonably well laid out site. Perhaps a 30-35 euro cubic meter roadside would be the cost of a harvester forwarder system, again generally speaking, and maybe for a chainsaw tractor or system, you well in excess of that, you might be going up €50 a cubic meter to the roadside and higher. Again, these are just indicative values. I might add to what I said earlier in terms of the price for firewood roadside. That's also species specific, so it could be lower than that for lower density species like Ian mentioned. Alder perhaps would not make that type of price. It's more for ash, oak, and the likes.
And Ian, in relation to the woodland improvement scheme, does it also apply to broadleaf and conifer mixtures? You just might elaborate and maybe just give an idea of the grand scheme as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so if you planted, say, a beech conifer mix or an oak Scots pine mix, for example, the thinning scheme is applicable to the thinning of those, because the objective of those was for the broadleaf species to be the final crop species, and the management of those means that you have to be very timely, that if the conifer is starting to overtop the broadleaf, you need to get in very quickly to manage those. Yet the thinning grant, it's €750 per hectare is payable on the first thinning, again carried out after 8 meters height.
Okay, and just back to you, Jonathan, for a second. A question about felon license. A felon license is required. Can you just maybe elaborate again on that?
Yeah, it's an important point. Under the 2014 Forestry Act, a felling license is required for felling trees in woodlands, and it's issued by the Department of Agriculture. Owners need to apply for it. Once approved, the license can be valid for 10 years with a possibility to extend it. So it can be just a once in a 10-year event. So for owners with thinning approaching 2 or 3 years ahead, it's advisable to apply now for a felling license, and I'll also might do in conjunction with a forest road grant if required. As our viewers are probably aware, we have experienced delays for some time in relation to felling licenses, and the forest industry clearly needs a continuous flow of licenses to function properly. So to fix this, we have a Project Woodland, was recently established, as well as to chart a new vision for Irish forestry. It has taken some time, but looking at the recent figure in relation to felling license issued in September, it would appear that a flow of licenses started to flow, to move. We had a statement by Minister of State Pippa Hackett's department recently confirming that the output has increased, and importantly outlining that there's an expectation that this increase is set to continue. So we also have an external regulatory review ongoing in relation to the licensing system. So going forward, the issue really is to find a balance between ensuring a supply of licenses and to key forestry activities, and also while at the same time safeguarding and ensuring due process.
Thank you. And Noel, just back to you. Is income tax payable on profits from firewood sales? From firewood?
Yeah, I wouldn't give tax advice, but I know forestry, income tax, the different rules for that. There's a question then obviously if you're going to a different business. So in actual fact, I don't know on the answer to that, because generally the people I'm dealing with are not only dealing with their own forestry, but will be dealing with other people's forestry. So in that sense, they're running a separate type business. So look, it's something that you'd want to be clarifying in terms of the tax officials on that one, to be honest with you.
Jonathan, do you want to say anything on that one?
Yeah, I would make in the comment that in matter of taxation, always consult a tax advisor.
Okay, and one or two more questions there.
Liam, just to say,
yeah.
I know there's great interest here tonight, so I'm conscious also that of the time. So maybe we'll take a couple of more questions before we wrap up.
Okay. And just Ian there, just in relation to the initial spacing in broadleaves, it was quite close, and just someone has asked what was the initial spacing there on the site that was on the video.
So spacings have changed over the years. Oak used to be planted at 2 by 0.75 meter spacing. Then it changed to 2 by 1.5. And same with the other broadleaves. It used to be 2 by 2 meters and 2 by 1.5 meters. But really, when you look at kind of natural regeneration and areas where there's lots of natural regeneration, the spacing that we're planting is nowhere near what natural regeneration seedlings tend to grow up in. So we do still need to plant relatively close spacing, but also being cognizant that we still need to have access for management. And that's why we have kind of that 2 meter spacing to allow easy accessibility down through the tree rows. But like I say, the spacing has changed over the years. And then the management of those trees also then impacts on the spacing with the thinning that's carried out. And that's the main thing that we need to be cognizant of, is that whatever spacing trees are planted at, that when competition starts to set in, that's when you need to get in and manage those trees for the benefit of those trees to remain vigorous, healthy, and the good quality trees. And with that management can often come the firewood coming out of the standard trees in that management.
Hey, Jonathan, I'm just going to put the last question to you. Can the owner thin their forests themselves with the woodland improvement scheme, or should they use a contractor or registered forester? So maybe you just take that.
No, that's definitely an option, and there's no impediment from the scheme. I would say if the owner would take the work on himself or herself, just make sure that there's suitable training and equipment and personal protective equipment is used. But other than health and safety, there's nothing to stop an owner, and I know plenty of owners that they've done so successfully.
Okay, and just one thing there, just in one of the there's a new wood fuel book that was recently printed by Peter Kaufman and Eugene Hendricks, so I'm just going to mention it. It's just that it has recently launched, so it may be of interest to some. So with that, Tom, I think I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, and again, thanks very much. We're now coming towards the end of this evening's webinar, but before we finish, I'd like to thank a few people. Jonathan Sykes, whose forest we videoed in and who provided valuable insights into the management of his forest. Ardagh O'Toole, his forestry consultant. I'd also like to thank Ned and John Liston, again down there near Newcastle West, who gave us a virtual visit to Liston fuel logs. I'd like to thank Noel Gavigan here from IrBEA for his very useful presentation and for his contributions to the follow-up discussion. Thanks, Noel.
No problem.
Thanks to my own colleagues on the panel, Jonathan Spatsy, Ian Short and Liam Kelly, And of course, Stephen Mahan, who did all the background work on video production, as well as managing the controls for tonight's webinar. Thanks to the Forestry Division of the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and also to our other colleagues in Teagasc who made this happen today on National Tree Day. So just finally, thanks to you, our valued audience, for watching, and hopefully you enjoyed this webinar and found it useful. And I think a question arose on the Q&A. A recording will be available in the near future on our website. And if you want to make sure not to miss out on upcoming events and to keep up to date on forestry issues, please sign up to our newsletter. It's the e-newsletter, and the link is also on our website, www.teagasc.ie/forestry. And I think, as was said earlier by my colleagues, we are working on more events and webinars. And if you have suggestions on any particular topics that you think might be useful, we are always very happy to hear them. So until we meet again at upcoming events, both virtually and hopefully, as circumstances start allowing, face-to-face, thank you very much for watching. Túr Ara agus Slán Amhála.